Welcome to 90.1 KBPK. Well, guys, the other day we were talking about Earth Day. We came to the symposium here at Fullerton College. The gentleman I talked to, Dr. Hobbs, I'm surprised that all three of us aren't on fire right about now. So we'll see how that goes later in the day. We had to move away from Joe a little, right? Because he was Mr. Optimism with his guest, and you and I are over in the burning, scorched earth syndrome.
Well, it's nice of you. You're getting away from me to save me.
That's
One
it.
of us here optimistic about the future of the planet, and you guys, well, that was something.
Well, hey, I was fine, but, you know, I could survive. I don't know about him, though.
Well,
Should I say goodbye now?
You know what? You can if you'd like, but my interviews were more emphasized on what Fullerton College can do, what the students can do, and what the local community can do. I don't know about you guys in your Outlook type of interviews, but mine was all about what each and every person can do for Earth Day.
So why don't we let you decide which one of us isn't going to be here tomorrow? Could it be Joe, Ryan, or the old guy? And if I say the old guy, that's got nothing to do if I might just keel over at any moment.
Or the trees at Fullerton College.
They could go, that's fine. So should we take a look at our interviews for Earth Day and see what the crowd thinks? Who's going to be here at the very end?
Absolutely.
Let's
So
go.
let's take it away.
All right.
Let's go to those interviews that we had for the Earth Day Symposium here at Fullerton College on 90.1 KBPK.
So we are here with Tom Morris. And Tom, one of the biggest things about Fullerton College is they always like to make sure that people are aware of what's going on in terms of the calendar. And, you know, since we're here for Earth Day, wanted to talk a little bit with you on what you have seen so far from students in your experience. Do they know what Earth Day is? Are they aware of it?
Well, our students are aware of a great deal, Ryan, and that they may not share with me, but they take my class, which is environmental biology, and my lab, environmental biology lab, because they have an interest in the environment. So they get to get their general education satisfied in biology by taking my class. So I don't really announce it, Earth Day, to them, you know, as a general deal, but generally they sometimes will tell me about it and talk about it and stuff. So I don't make a big deal out of it because I'm focusing more on the science of things. And so, yeah, for me, Earth Day in my classes, it's I'm sorry to say, it's just not a big deal.
I mean, when you mention your classes, have you ever had that student that comes into your class just, like you mentioned, wanting to fulfill that GE requirement, and then all of a sudden they just take right to it?
Well, yeah, I mean, that happens a lot, and because it's interesting. I mean, what my classes are about is about the nature of the planet, the natural science of the planet, the living things, and they take my class, a biology class, because they're interested in that. And yeah, right. And there's a lot of surprises as well, the things that they didn't know about that they find exciting and interesting. So yeah.
Is there one specific part of, let's say, a regular spring semester where you've noticed students really start to pique their interest because they go, I never knew that before, and then it takes off from there?
Well, this semester I'm teaching all online, so unfortunately I don't have that personal contact with them where I would have in a classroom, and so I had to say, I wish I could say, yes, Ryan, let me tell you great examples of that, and I'm going to be truthful with you because I'm online and stuff. Those opportunities for spontaneous conversations and stuff, they just don't happen, and that's why I'm excited to hopefully be back on campus in my classroom again in the fall.
When you mention your area of expertise and also what you teach as well, what got you interested in that subject to start with?
Okay, so since we're talking about Earth Day, my first experience with Earth Day was on the very first Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970. I was a high school student, and there was an activity on my high school campus about respecting the environment, learning about the environment, honoring the environment. That's what started it. Plus, there are lots of things were happening in the 60s. There was Rachel Carson's Silent Spring.
Right.
There was Paul Ehrlich's population bomb, and there was also Jacques Cousteau, who had a wonderful nature series on the ocean. So those are the experiences that I had that kind of got me started. Plus, I'm a nature lover. I love animals. I love nature. So that's what got me started on this, and I've been very, very fortunate to be able to continue those interests and to share my love for nature at Fullerton College with many years of students in my classes.
I mean, you mentioned that one date that you can go right back to and say, hey, this is exactly where it started for me. Do you feel that when you teach these students, you're trying to give them that opportunity to, hey, I'm not pushing you in this direction, but I'm giving you these information, or I'm giving you the information and the ability to have that date for themselves once they finish their educational career?
Well, every teacher wants to be inspiring. I think that's what you're talking about, is
Yeah.
what kind of inspiration. I don't know if I'm very inspirational. And I do try to pick topics and cover topics in ways that are interesting and not just wonky and technical, but are interesting and things that they can relate to. When, for example, in our field class, in my environmental biology lab, we visit various nature sites in Orange County, places where my students generally have not been, like Oak Canyon Nature Center, Upper Newport Bay, and Newport Beach, for example. Even the local Fullerton Arboretum over here at Cal State Fullerton. Okay. So we try to give them opportunities to experience this stuff in the field, and then they do light up. They do see the eyes light up. They enjoy being out in the field. So that's where it really happens.
When you're on campus here at Fullerton, one of the biggest things is the environment that they've created in terms of what different trees are here, what animals that they allow to go through the back half of campus that, some other community college, it's just all concrete, just pure concrete that you see, and you don't really get an opportunity to interact with the wind, the trees, what's going on around you nature-wise as well. When you look at Fullerton College campus, do you feel that the environment that they've created in terms of the plants, the animals, and also once we get back to person, having that chance to interact with people is a little bit more, we'll say, fluent towards learning than other campuses you may have been on?
Well, I mean, the landscaping here is beautiful. There's no doubt about that. But I will tell you, I'm a critic of it because it's not consistent with the climate. Right? We live in a Mediterranean type of climate, which is cool, moist winters, hot, dry summers. And the plants that we have here come from a climate that gets rain most of the year. Lots of trees, but trees require that the roots be in moist soil all year round. So if I was going to redesign, if anybody were to ask me, well, what would you do instead, Mr. Morris? Well, I would probably pursue more of a xeriscape approach, where you'd have Palo Verde trees, you might some mesquite, and some other decorative desert plants from our local deserts, that kind of a thing. And you can still create a lovely aesthetic environment, but at the same time, reducing your water consumption.
It's interesting that you mention that, because a lot of Californians don't really realize the plants and also the environment that's natural to Southern California and the climate that you mentioned as well. Because of all, the housing, everything that's being developed, they just chip in whatever trees they think are pretty and etc.
Yeah, I know, and I grew up in Southern California, and I saw this, the development of the chaparral and the coastal sage scrub communities that would be in the hills and stuff. And yes, then they populated the neighborhoods, they landscaped the neighborhoods with imported plants, exotic plants that normally don't live here, don't even live in California. Like these magnolia trees. I mean, they're from the southeastern part of the United States. And they're beautiful, I love them. But they're not, as far as I know, they're not native to California, and they're certainly not appropriate for this kind of a climate. So they take a lot of water to get started, and then they have to make sure that that moisture in the ground is there all year round.
When you talk about that, let's say someone's watching and they go, okay, I want to be a little bit more conscious about, the environment that I create. Maybe it's at their house, their home, or just in general in the environment that they live in. If they're looking to kind of say, okay, how can I reduce what my impact is around me to things that are native, what can they do?
Well, they can first of all, go to a nursery and pick a nursery that specializes in native plants. They're not easy to find. And if you can find one, I mean, there is a nursery where I live in South County, Orange County, and there is a nursery out the Ortega Highway. I can't remember the name of it, but they do specialize in native plants. But my students and everybody's experts on searching, so just search, drought-tolerant plants, nursery, and near me, and you'll find it. And so there are ways to do it. And the nice thing about, like they call it xeriscape with an X. Okay. The nice thing about xeriscape is the plants are very, very robust. They can tolerate a lot of stress, which means they can tolerate less water, which means that they're easy to manage in a garden. And also the nice thing about xeriscape is that you space the plants out to give that sense of openness, which is very, very, it's a very, very nice aesthetic effect. And it's also representative of if you go to the desert and you look at the way the plants are distributed, they're widely distributed. Yeah. So you don't get turf like this here that we see in the quad. It's lovely, but there's no such thing as turf in the desert or in the chaparral or in the coastal sage scrub in our local hills.
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Okay. I'm really not an expert on landscape architecture, but those are my 2 cents worth. So.
But see, here's what we love here on 90.1 KBPK. You mentioned growing up in Southern California, having the opportunity to see it develop, also knowing what's native around here. Not many people realize that, especially if they're not native to Southern California, or maybe their father, their mother brought them over recently from another state. Well, they don't know this. Mm-hmm. And it's nice to be able to hear from someone who's here at Fullerton College, knows the students, and also knows what Southern California was originally and how you can help it out. So thank you very much.
Thank you,
we
Ryan.
Appreciate it.
Pleasure talking to you.
So you just heard from Tom Morris, and once again, we're here with Earth Day on 90.1 KBPK. So we're going to take this moment to transition into another interview. We've got Joseph Pavlenko talking to Aline Gregorio.
90.1 KBPK. I'm Joseph Pavlenko, and we're out here for Earth Day at Fullerton College. And if you didn't know, Fullerton College puts on a symposium. Aline Gregorio was here, helped put all of it together, and one of the focuses of it was fossil fuel divestment this year, I believe, correct?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I feel like that's the thing. You got to put your money where your mouth is. I live in Moreno Valley now, take the train in, doing my part. Is mass transit and stuff like that something that you covered at the symposium today?
The symposium was more focused on how colleges have their funds invested. So in particular, the big movement right now in the state of California is to support the Fossil Fuel Divestment Act. Okay. And that has to do with how teacher pension funds are invested in fossil fuels. So we had 2 keynote speakers to talk about, how problematic that is. But I think of point of interest is to debunk the common perspective that divesting from fossil fuels is not financially prudent. So we did have Tom Sanzillo, who's an energy analyst and financial analyst, who talked about how today in 2022, investing in fossil fuels is actually irresponsible, as it is a high-risk investment, and fossil fuel companies are just not doing as good as they used to do. So it's time for us to have real serious conversations about shifting those dollars elsewhere.
So you guys got real serious. Instead of kind of the small bean stuff that I'm thinking, maybe, ride the bus, take the train, do that kind of stuff. You're saying, no. Get out of the way. Let's put less money into this kind of stuff that we know is creating a harmful impact to the environment and is going to leave, as we said earlier in the piece, the planet probably less good than how we got it when, we came into it and all that kind of stuff. Aside from pension plans and that sort of stuff, what are some of the other topics you talked about at the symposium today?
Yes, I think one of the things that I'm really engaged in and really excited about is the potential that large-scale institutions have in shifting away from fossil fuels. So the second event was the decarbonization panel, where we learned from Santa Monica College and Mount SAC about their plans to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but campuses like Fullerton College have, in the fall 2019 peak, it had over 20,000 students. So that's the size of a small city. And when you think about all of those students gathering and all the energy that is used, the waste and the transportation, so if we can plan to minimize that impact, it can really, really be impactful.
So minimizing that would take us to the sustainability efforts that are being done at Fullerton College, which is something that you're also a part of, because why tackle part of the issue when you can do the entire thing, right?
Right. So I believe in systemic change. I think that, yes, we all have a different array of choices when it comes to our individual choices, like transportation and diet and et cetera. And all of the things that you hear about, that you should be doing on Earth Day and beyond Earth Day, hopefully, which is trying to live a greener lifestyle. But I'm mostly interested in large-scale systemic change. And as the co-chair of the Sustainability Committee at Fullerton College, we've been focusing on that. And recently, if I am to be optimistic, I would say that the story of North Orange County Community College District is a story of steep strides towards that. We used to not have any sustainability commitments or sustainability policies, and this year the district passed a really substantial policy that will hold the college accountable to reducing its ecological footprint. And like I said, when you make a commitment to reduce the ecological footprint of 20,000 people, it's a big commitment.
So, as someone that didn't know anything about the sustainability efforts happening at Fullerton College, prior to contacting all of you because I heard about the symposium and Earth Day, what are some of the initiatives happening at Fullerton College that you can educate anybody that's watching this about?
Yes, I think the big front, that we've been able to sustain is that yearly educational event. So that's pretty new. It was only the 6th Earth Day Symposium, where we're continuously bringing expertise to our students and have this community event to carry on the tradition of Earth Day, which we call it a celebration, but it's not. It's a mobilization. It started with teach-ins and with a rebellion against the future that had been set, that is polluting the environment and destroying the planet. So continuing that tradition has been really big for us. As far as initiatives right now is materializing the policy that we just passed and start seeing some real gains from it, from the commitments that the district has made. We hired an interim sustainability director that is right now collecting data on how much energy we used to use and how much energy we need to save in order to really make a difference in how we operate.
And I know there's been some constructions happening at Fullerton College. I know they put in a big chiller plant. Was that anything that the Sustainability Committee was part of with that renovation and potentially keeping the campus cooler in a more efficient way?
Unfortunately, no. So it is my understanding that there were some standards, right? Certainly California has very strict policies on new buildings, so that alone is a great thing. But there are some green building standards that have been utilized in the new building construction, but we were not part of that process. But this policy that we just adopted will bring in the same level of credit as like a LEED certified building, where we would have someone, measure up our energy use, measure up, and making sure that we are doing the things that we said that we would do. So that third party element is essential, and the college is committing to that, to have a certified STARS certification to the way that we operate the campus.
Okay. And you're talking big brushstrokes types of things being done at this college. And we heard earlier, the small things versus the big things and what can create an impact. And I know something my wife and I talk about at home every so often is all the ads seem to be targeted towards don't use the plastic straws, use reusable bags, and it's all at the consumer, and it's putting a lot of onus on the consumer. And that's something that, and we're trying to be optimistic here, but that's one of the things that makes me feel a little bit like, well, shoot, how much can I actually do? Is that something that, is that why you're going for the broader brush strokes and trying to tackle the larger problem versus kind of keeping it focused on the individual and the little things that they can do?
Yes, and also because we are empowered differently. We have different choices of the cars that we drive, the foods that we eat, and the assumption that everyone can make impactful decisions is a flawed assumption, right? And I think that policy and systemic change is what we need, and we can all individually engage with that, engage with our cities, engage with our campuses, and make big change. I'm not saying there's no place for grassroots. I think grassroots efforts could focus more on policy and your individual actions for as much as you can make, your individual choices also make a difference, but that's not necessarily my focus.
I mean, that's, like I said, trying to be optimistic here, but that's one of the things that makes me feel a little bit hopeless when thinking about this and, this giant rock that we're all flying through the universe on, and how ideally we'd like to leave it better. And it's good to hear that there's actually people out there doing the things, trying to be institutional changes, I believe is what you were saying,
yes.
right? So we had this, you walked out of the symposium today, feeling better, feeling worse? What was the general mood, aside from, I'm sure, relief after planning something like this?
I always feel inspired to meet like-minded folks who are trying to take a handle of our future and take more control of where our future is going. And, also learning about how much mobilization we have right now with the global climate strikes, with the continued Earth Day events, with people showing up in Sacramento to make their voices heard about divestment and the current bills that California politicians are reviewing and considering, including the Fossil Fuel Divestment Act. I think those things really make me optimistic.
So we've talked a lot about the committees you're part of, the event that you put on today for the symposium at Fullerton College. You're also a professor at Fullerton College. So what's the consensus you get from students when you talk to them about sustainability and the environment and how we're trying to leave the planet hopefully better?
Yes, teaching geography can be quite challenging, as a lot of students are not really familiar with geography, and certainly geography is a very earth-centered discipline. And my general feeling in teaching the subject is of hope, but my students make me hopeful. My students are interested and concerned about climate change. My students want to see change and to enact change. And which is why I'm not content in only teaching global environmental problems, which is a class that I teach, but also to be part of something that helps my students see a different future in the future that they want.
All right. Well, thank you for your time today. Thank you for putting on the symposium at Fullerton College. I've been Joseph Pavlenko. We've been talking to Professor Gregorio, who helped put on this wonderful event that's held 6 years now, looking forward to 7 years being held here at Fullerton College.
90.1 KBPK. Want to thank Joseph again for getting that interview with Professor Gregorio. And that's actually going to be our transition to move it over to Mark Pavlovich, who takes a little bit of a different tone with his interview with Dr. Roy Hobbs.
Welcome to Earth Day on 90.1 KBPK. Hey, I'm lucky enough to be with Roy Hobbs. Well, no, he's not the baseball player from the Natural. It's Dr. Roy Hobbs, who is one of the top environmental scientists here in Southern California, California in whole, and they've had a symposium about Earth Day. And of course, when we talk about Earth Day with actual scientists, not like the layman like Joe and I out here, it's basically got that thing that's fashionable. Hey, it's Earth Day. Let's put on our t-shirts. Let's walk around and say how we're going to save the environment as I get into my fossil fuel car and drive away and say thank you. It's been a lot of fun. Fill it up on the way home, but still have my t-shirt and my little badge on. and then sort of go, you want me to do what? So I'm going to get out of that phase, and let's go into your world about what's happening on environmentally and what we, the people of the world, are doing to basically destroy our future and our generation's futures afterwards, with us thinking what we're doing is progress is really not progress. It's taking us back to the Stone Ages.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's interesting if you look at the trends that we've seen with human development since the Industrial Revolution. If we look at it, we've seen a drastic rise in population, and along with the increase in population size, we've seen also a rise in affluence and a rise in technology, our ability to exploit the planet, right? And so when we look at the consequences of that for natural systems, we see habitat destruction, where we're taking natural areas and converting them for human use, whether it be agriculture or logging or ranching, whatever we're doing. We see overexploitation, where we're killing things faster than they can reproduce. Really significant, say, for sharks in the oceans. They estimate that maybe we kill 100 million sharks a year. And then we see non-native species, where we're moving animals and plants around the planet, and they have a negative effect on things when they get to those new locations. Like we've seen an increase in Burmese pythons, for instance, or introduction and explosion of Burmese pythons in the Florida Everglades and affecting the species there. Or in the marine environment, we've seen lionfish from the Pacific introduced to the coral reefs in the Caribbean and eating the native species there. And then we see a variety of pollution, plastic pollution's in the news a lot, and then climate change, right? And and I know later, we'll talk some about climate change, but when the humans, when we're burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, we're releasing the byproducts into the atmosphere.
Right.
And those, the carbon dioxide and methane as examples, they hold on to heat per molecule. So the more of those molecules we release, the warmer the atmosphere gets. That heat gets transferred into the oceans as well. So most of the heat that we've seen as a product of human activities heating up has actually been transferred into the oceans. And then that has a strong effect on ocean systems. And coral reefs are one of those things. The hotter it gets for the waters.
And they're slowly dying, aren't they?
They are, yeah. So when you look at the projections we're seeing, they estimate that if we warm 2 degrees Celsius, which is where we'll be about the middle of the century on the track that we're on, that less than 1% of the original extent of coral reefs will be still around at that point. So we're looking at the complete collapse of one of the world's major ecosystems within our lifetimes if we continue down the path we're going.
So we destroy the coral reefs. Let's say that we do that, and the animals who live there, the ocean itself that depends on the coral reef for a variety of different reasons, it goes away. So species-wise, how many other species are going to disappear because the coral reefs disappear?
We don't have an exact number on that, but we can both, globally overall kind of estimate a likely extinction rate, and then we can think about what we estimate uses the reefs, and so that would kind of be maybe what we might expect to be impacted. So if we look at coral reefs, estimates are about 25% of marine species use coral reefs at some point in their life. So you probably wouldn't lose all of those, because there may be some, some of those that aren't completely dependent on that. They might be use it more facultatively, and then be able to still find resources some other place. But a large percentage of that would be solely dependent on the reef, so we'd expect to lose a big percentage of biodiversity there. And then that's compounded by the other things we do in the ocean, like overfishing or habitat destruction, those kinds of things. So they don't just work species aren't just affected by one thing, right? But they get the synergistic effect of all the different stuff that we're doing.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting you bring that up, because people look at when species start to disappear, they blame it on one aspect of things. But if I take away a natural predator, a species is going to grow because I destroyed that natural predator because of what I've done to the environment. So therefore, this is going to get larger. There's going to be less there for the rest of the species, or there's going to be that species that no longer can come and take me away. So there's an imbalance then of certain species currently in our oceans?
Yeah, so there's we see like a destabilization of ecosystems as we start to remove pieces from those, and then that removes competitors or predators or prey items or parasites, and then we see kind of the system trying to adjust to that, right? Not in a conscious way, right, but just as they go through their evolutionary processes, and so that can mean sort of a ripple effect to impact a lot of other species beyond the one that we just think we're directly impacting. And when we look on land, that's true for land as well. And in terms of kind of some of the numbers, they estimate that from climate change alone, we might lose as much as 20% of the world's species. Wow. Overall, with looking at everything humans are doing, impacting, they say maybe 25 to 50% of all the world's species by the end of 2100 if we continue down this path. So if we think, right, what are the animals that we can name, elephants, rhinoceros, lions, tigers, et cetera, right? And just start crossing off every other one or every fourth one and picture living in that kind of a world, right? We're leaving something very different to the future than what we've been experiencing.
And what seems to be forgotten here too is we talk about animal life that's dissipating because of what we've done to our environment, but there's also plant life. I mean, I look at this campus itself. Fullerton's been known as the tree city for so many things, but you look at places like down where the rainforest has been devastated. I have to sit there and say to myself, then what other plant life has been affected by cutting away the rainforest that is in that region alone? So what do we look when we look at plant life being affected by what's going on environmentally right now? Are we losing the plant life and the vegetation, not just because of population, but because of everything else?
Yeah, absolutely. And so you mentioned the tropical rainforest, as an example. When we look at the diversity of species in the tropical rainforest, it's extremely high relative to what we see in our area or in temperate zones. And there's a lot of very specialized species. So when you look at destroying the habitat and its effect on plants or animals as well, you have a couple different things going on, right? One is you're just clearing an area, right? So for some species that have a broader distribution, that means fewer overall individuals, so a decline in the population, which can have an impact on their ability to reproduce and genetic diversity in the future. But you also have species that have a very narrow distribution, right? And it may be that the only place in the entire world that they live is in that area that we happen to destroy. So they've seen this in certain sides of certain mountain ranges in South America and things like that where that's happened. So you can lose a species just through one set of activities in one area or many species, but you can also then have this sort of ripple effect out in causing population declines and then genetic problems, a whole host of things that result as well. And again, that affects both the plants and the animals. Yeah.
One of the big things I look at is with all the scientists that were at the symposium today and everything else, and you look at all the governments that are involved, when we look at the future and we look at what may be there for my grandchildren or my great-grandchildren or yours when it case of matter, I mean, is it going to have any familiarity to what I grew up with? I'm an old guy.
Yeah.
So, lions, tigers, and bears all existed. I mean, are we going to have this barren wasteland with no plants and very few animals around, and how do we sustain ourselves then? Is it that bleak? Is it that bleak?
I think that's a good question, and I think it depends on who you speak to and sort of how they see those outcomes. But I think if you look at the United Nations reports that have come out about climate change and from the Convention on Biological Diversity for the United Nations, you look at the projections for population growth, I think it is that bleak. It's always a struggle, right? How do you encourage, hope, right? And so people don't just throw up their hands and not want to do anything, right? Well, at the same time, acknowledging reality, right? And so we continue to work through reality to try to achieve a better future, right? But I think it is. I think, imagine if we were in that position, right, where we've lost coral reefs completely, right? We've seen 25% of the world's, species disappear. We don't know. We haven't been through this. Humans have only been around, depending on the estimates, 200 to 350,000 years as a species, right? And we haven't seen this level of extinction, and this level of impacts on the planet since, prior to that time when we had some of the major mass extinctions of the planet. And so I don't think we really know, how we're going to survive through this. And I, personally, and I think a lot of the things that I read indicate that, we're looking for our children's lives to be lower quality than our lives were, right? And that's depressing because that's sort of the first generation American. Right, we sort of thought about that, right? We've always thought about, our children are always going to have better lives than we do. But it doesn't look like it's going to be that way at the pathway that we're going. Just as an example, the United Nations, they use what's called an ecological footprint to estimate the impacts that humans are having on the planet. And by 2002, they estimated we were already at that population size and that level of resource availability. We were already using a planet and a half worth of your resources
Got it.
every year, right? So that means that if you think about like having a bank account, right, you know, and you're like, okay, I'm going to take $100,000 and have it in the bank, right? And then every year, this is, numbers don't work right in the current economy, right? But if you had $100,000 in the bank, right, and you're going to get 10% interest, you know, and you can live off of $10,000 a year, right? As long as you don't touch that $100,000, you get $10,000 again and again, right? But what if one year you live off of $12,000, right? Now you got $98,000 generating it, right? And now you're trying to live off $12,000 every year, right? And that's going down and down and down and down. And eventually you get to a place, right, where you've eaten through all those resources, you've got no money left, right? That's sort of, we think, what's happening with the planet, right? Is we have this, what's produced each year by the world's resources, right, natural resources, and what we're doing is we're using them faster than they can replenish themselves, an earth and a half or more worth of resources every year. So the availability of those resources, that resource base, declines year after year after year, right? So as what we see is going up and thinking, oh, we're doing good, right? We're getting higher and higher and higher, so resources must be available. Well, we're doing that by eating into the available resources. So what happens when we start to get down to the bottom and eating through all those resources, and we have this high population that we've built off of that, right? Right. It's very concerning for the quality of human life, right? As well as for all the other things living on the planet. And I think that sort of brings up an important point, because you often hear certain segments of our society, you know, saying that it's sort of the, you know, it's jobs, it's, you know, people versus the environment, right? You know, you care more about the animals than you do about the people. I would argue you can't care about people without caring about the environment when you look at where things are headed and what the scientists know about that.
So as we sum this up, before I let you go, I mean, when everybody talks about the environment, we look at it in general, no matter if we're looking at the oceans on land, if we're looking at air quality, or if we're just looking at what you and I are discussing right now. Is there that essential villain, or are we in general all the essential villains in destroying the environmental aspects of our life?
I think, again, sort of depends on how you look at it, you know, but I mean, each of us, right, cumulatively contributes some amount, right? And where you live in the world and the lifestyle that's common within that particular location in the world determines if you have more sort of or less effect on that, right? So as a person living in the US, we have a much stronger impact through our lives on the resource of the planet and on the future of the planet, because we have such a consumptive lifestyle relative to somebody in some of the poorest countries of the world. But beyond each individual, there's also the government and the corporate contributions,
world,
right? And there's certain corporations that are contributing, say, for instance, the bulk of the greenhouse gas emissions, certain countries contributing the bulk of the greenhouse gas emissions. So although we're all sort of contributing in our own way, there are definitely sort of bigger, more evil sort of villains, if you want, you know, depending how you want to characterize them, right? Than just, you know, each individual.
So before I let you go, Dr. Hobbs, a sense of optimism for anybody watching this whole thing. I mean, you and I have sort of talked doom and gloom through our whole thing, and I mean, I'm going to be lucky if I make it 75 the way it's going. Is there any optimism? Did you see that in the symposium today with all the scientists that were there? Optimism was a word that was even talked about or used?
You know, I think the challenge is.
I like how he's dancing around.
You like that, right? How very politic of me, right? Yes. No. My point is this: is that I say where the optimism is that we know what to do. We know what the problems are. We know what to do. We know how to fix them. We have the technology to fix them. We have the money to fix them. So the optimism is that all the pieces are there to address the problem. The reason not to be optimistic is many of these things we've known for decades, 30, 40 years, what's happening. And each step, when we've had an opportunity to try to change something and take a different path, we never do, right? And so what we see is worse and worse and worse problems accumulating because we decide as a society by the people we elect, right, not to do anything about it, right? And then as that gets worse and worse and worse, our ability to change that pathway gets smaller and smaller and smaller, right? You know, if you had to be here, right, you know, here in, you know, right, by 2100, right, and you're here today, right? If you started here, then you got this trajectory here, more of a gradual trajectory up to where we need to be. But if you wait until 2022 or 2050, now the relative changes changes you have to make are much more significant and much more drastic, much harder for our society to absorb, right? And to get the outcomes that we want to get with as little pain to ourselves as possible, right? And so that would be my reason not to be optimistic. And we're talking about, when you look at what the United Nations is saying, they're talking about things that aren't even part of our discussion, right? Like, how do we decouple quality of life from resource consumption, right? In the U.S., right, who dies with the most toys wins, right? You know?
Exactly.
But we have to decouple that idea of quality of life from the use of resources. We have to think completely differently about our economic system and how we view regrowth and a whole host of other things. You know, how our corporations run and how they reward shareholders, et cetera, et cetera.
So we redefine success.
We redefine success, and we redefine sort of our ethical pathways as well.
Exactly.
You know, and so I think that's the thing. You know, that's the reason for hope, is because we know what to do, and we can do it, and we have the possibility of doing it. The reason not to hope is because when we've been presented with those opportunities, we've chosen not to do anything about it.
So we're going to end this with optimism. I'm here with Dr. Roy Hobbs, who says, hey, there's a chance for tomorrow. Stick
So
around
you say
with
there's
us.
a chance.
There's a chance. Stick around with us here on 90.1 KBPK for a little more optimism, as we're going to have a couple more voices come on the air. Maybe a little less gloom and doom and a little more smiles here on Earth Day on 90.1 KBPK. Thank you, Dr. Hobbs.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
So a big thank you to Dr. Hobbs for joining us, and also Mark Pavlovich on the air. And we're going to finish it off for Earth Day on 90.1 KBPK with Roman De Jesus. So we are here with Roman De Jesus, Earth Day. That is our subject here on 90.1 KBPK. And Roman, earlier you were mentioning oceanography, and that kind of piqued my interest, because going into school, that was one of the big things that I wanted to learn about. When you look at oceanography, you know, some people here in Southern California, they just go, well, we've got the beach down there. That's about all I know about the ocean, and especially here in Southern California. When you look at what people can learn more about, especially on an Earth Day type of event, is there something specific that they could look at and say, okay, how can I reduce my impact on the ocean close to me?
So there are a couple of things, and a lot of people are aware of beach cleanups, which are great because they do a service not only for the local beaches but also the ecosystems. The local ecosystems are affected by plastics and other materials that flow into not just the oceans, but they initially flow into the rivers, which then flow into the ocean. And that can impact any level of different organisms, going all the way from the smallest organisms and phytoplankton all the way up to large fish. And they tend to, as we've seen recently, there's been a lot of studies published that have shown plastics inside these organisms. And so generally, kind of keeping those things out of the waterways and into the trash is probably one of the biggest things and easiest things that people can do. The other things that are important are kind of a little bit more global, but they are affecting our oceans, such as sea level rise and ocean acidification. Those are the two big things I focus on in my classes when it comes to human impacts. And although there's no one specific action that you can do to kind of help improve those or help mitigate those, what's important is it requires somewhat of a kind of actions every day to kind of start doing that. And so ocean acidification is caused by excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so it has to do with climate change. And basically, if it wasn't for the oceans, we'd have a lot more carbon dioxide in the ocean, or excuse me, in the atmosphere. And so the oceans have been a good buffer for absorbing CO2. And then with sea level rise, that is an impact as a result of climate change. So the warmer temperatures have warmed up the surface ocean, which causes the surface ocean to expand and ultimately causes sea level to rise. Now here in Southern California, it hasn't had a huge impact, but if you were to go to someplace, for example, like Balboa Island in Newport Beach, you'll notice that they compare high tides during the winter, which are generally referred to as king tides. Those are starting to go over the little seawalls in Balboa Island. So, I think this past year, including some of the streets were actually underwater during those high tides. And if you add wind or storms to that, that might soon get into some of the low-lying houses there as well. So it does have an impact, but more on localized areas currently. In the future, that could be a problem for other areas as well.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned that because, you know, growing up here in Southern California, all we basically get told in school is just, oh, you know, make sure that you cut a hole into the 6-pack of soda plastic so that way, you know, the sea turtles are fine, but we're never really told the immediate impact that it could have. Like you mentioned, Balboa Island, that's really close here to Southern California, just off the coast, and it's making an impact. So when you have our viewers here at 90.1 KBPK watching, they think to themselves, okay, well, I didn't know it was this big of an issue. Where is one place that they can go that they can kind of look at and say, okay, these are the stats of what's exactly happening to the ocean in terms of water level rising and also the acidification?
Okay, so sea level rise over the past 100 years or so, depending on where you're at, and this has been differentiated in different locations. So some areas of the coastline are experiencing a little bit more sea level rise. Some areas are experiencing a little less. It really depends on your general coastline setting and geological settings. But here in Southern California, over the past 100 years, sea level has risen maybe on the order of 5 to 7 centimeters, which is only a couple of inches. If climate change continues and we have a warming of the average global temperature by up to 3 degrees Celsius, we could be looking at somewhere between 6 to 12 inches sea level rise.
Wow.
And so that will definitely put Balboa Island underwater at many times during the year. Other low-lying areas along maybe Huntington Beach or even Long Beach could also be flooded during certain times of the year. So that has a huge impact. But as far as ocean acidification, well, the oceans are about 30% more acidic now because of the excess CO2. And that, for people, that doesn't have a huge impact, but that does affect marine organisms. Yeah. And ultimately, it's going to affect different food webs, particularly, for example, coral reefs. Those are areas that are experiencing a large amount of acidification. So, and you add the heat stress to coral reefs, and a lot of coral reefs are bleaching. A good example is in Australia. The Great Barrier Reef has experienced a large die-off the past few years. But then also, there are small organisms called phytoplankton, specifically coccolithophores. These guys make their shells out of calcium carbonate. And they form the base of the food webs in many open ocean areas, and so they would not form their shells as well under these high acid conditions, and therefore, being the base of the food web, there's less food for other organisms to eat, and that has a trickle down effect or trickle up effect based on the food webs.
And people don't realize that it starts, like you mentioned, the phytoplankton. It starts really small, and then the impact is felt at the next level, and it keeps going up and up until you see really major impacts that people go, oh, okay, well, now I'm seeing it on the news, now I'm going to pay attention, but it's happening all along beforehand. When you look at what can be done in terms of just the small things that just someone in a household could do in order to help out their daily life, what's one thing that they could do, even if it's small, in their own life?
Yeah, so I think the important thing is that nobody and no single group is going to change all of this all at once. The problems that we're experiencing now in terms of climate change has been basically over the past 150 years. So shifting that infrastructure is going to take time, but it is very important that we do that as soon as possible. And as far as we personally go, on the individual level, I like to tell everybody to do something more locally. So you think globally, act locally, and individually you can, we typically think of the reduce, reuse, recycle mantra. Yeah. Well, that is the way you should be doing things. You should be reducing your consumption. So, for example, don't go out and buy a lot of stuff with a lot of packaging, and ultimately some of that small packaging ends up in our waterways. So we could just do away with that. And if we do need to consume things, we can reuse things. I think during the pandemic, I've seen a large shift for many companies to kind of refurbish and resell goods. which has been really good because of the whole initial shortage, but then also it's just good to reuse things.
Yeah.
And then obviously when you can't reuse things, instead of just throwing things in the trash, you recycle it. So, that's a really good mantra to have, but just pay attention to those first two, because we automatically think recycling when we hear that mantra. And so reduce, reuse, and recycle is probably a good starting point for most of us.
So Earth Day 2022 is our subject here on 90.1 KBPK. When you take a look at Earth Day, is there one thing that you're telling your students to kind of pay attention to?
Not necessarily, just because it's nice to bring it's kind of like those Hallmark holidays that I like to say, something like Mother's Day or Valentine's Day, that we celebrate something just on one single day. And that's kind of what I think of Earth Day. But I like to tell my students, if you just remember, Earth Day is every day. This is the only planet we have. This is something we all need to take care of. And if we all do our part, hopefully we'll come up with solutions to help make the future better.
Well, awesome. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
You.
We've been talking with Roman DeJesus here on Earth Day 2022.
90.1 KBPK. And I think that's about it for us here at Fullerton College for Earth Day, wrapping up this whole thing. We'd like to thank the science department, their lovely buildings right behind us. Don't think we mentioned that yet. Other things we didn't mention is thanking the professors that took the time out of their days to come and join us and talk to Ryan, Mark, myself on the air.
Dr. Roy Hobbs, who joined Mark Pavlovich, Aline Gregorio, professor here at Fullerton College, who joined Joseph Pavlenko, then also Tom Morris, who joined myself on the air, and Roman DeJesus. So all four of those professors here at Fullerton College joining us for Earth Day.
Thanks to Fullerton College for hosting this event. And I think we're going to call it a day here at 90.1 KBPK. Earth Day 2022 in the books, guys.
I'm ready.